Okay.
Give me 1 second.
Yep.
Go.
Hi there. My name is Jason Wood. I'm the University Archivist and Deputy Director here at the Simmons University Library. I'm very happy to talk to you this week for your module in LIS 456, Records Management. I'm going to offer you the perspective of being a records manager who has those responsibilities embedded in his role as an institutional archivist, specifically at a small university such as Simmons University. In this case, the records management responsibilities, while not in my job title, are certainly a core function of my position and are actually documented in my job description. For a little bit of context and perspective on all this, the Simmons University Archives was founded in the 1970s with the mission of documenting the history of Simmons University. Over the intervening 20 years, around the mid-1990s, records management responsibilities were added to the purview of the institutional archives. This was done for a couple reasons. First and foremost, to recognize that records management was becoming much more of a business responsibility, even at nonprofit institutions such as Simmons, and also as a means of enhancing the functionality and to ensure that the university archives, the college archives at the time, could maintain a second professional position. There's certainly significant alignment between the key core responsibilities and functions carried out in an archives, institutional archives, and that of a records manager. There's also a significant, but I would argue not complete, knowledge overlap between archivists and our good friends in the records management field. Certainly, the collection development policy of the institutional archives aligns significantly with the functions a records manager carries out. Much of the material we collect and hold in the Simmons University Archives is institutional records which document the history of the college from an administrative standpoint. Records from the office of the president, provost, other significant offices. And a very particular and important context to be mindful of when thinking about records management in a college and university setting such as this is the regulatory scope of colleges and universities. As I'm sure you've learned already in your course, records management responsibility, if you will, is largely dependent upon the environment in which it's carried out. Some industries, banking, healthcare, for instance, are very highly regulated at both the federal and state level. Colleges and universities are far less highly regulated, with the exception, of course, of public universities. All that being said, though, even in a nonprofit educational institution, there are significant records created and maintained here which have regulatory compliance needs, such as personnel records, student records, financial documentation, health records, those kind of stuff. So that's just a way of setting the scope for you and understanding that even though records management, while at a college university level, looks and feels much different from that at a for-profit institution, while the concepts in play are largely the same. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about how the program here at the Simmons University Archives, the records management program, developed over the years. And I think that's a really important lens to kind of look at the program through and understand sort of the relational and the communication aspects at play within the archives, through the records management program, and at the institution as a whole. As I mentioned, the RM program in the Simmons Archives was put in place in the 1990s. It was there to ensure that the archives could continue to support having a second full-time professional position. Initially, it was used both as a regulatory compliance tool, as most records management programs are, but also, and importantly, as a means for the archive staff to conduct outreach and ensure that the visibility of the archives was broad and consistent across the institution. And also, to be honest, it was used as a collection development tool. As I mentioned, so many of our records are institutional records by nature, so being able to go into folks' offices, consult with them about their record-keeping practices, often in the process of doing that kind of outreach, records of historical value might emerge and were then accessioned, whether at that point or at a later point, into the archives collections. So this kind of approach of visiting departments was carried out for, you know, the earliest years of the program, and it's very much a traditional or it's a logical approach, I guess, to the early stages of an RM program. These individual department visits, the records manager visited the Office of Admissions and the Office of Graduate Admissions and the Office of Admissions for each of the graduate schools. Likewise, my predecessor in the role visited the Office of Sociology and the Office of Psychology and the Office of Biology. So all these departments were visited as well. And all these visits increased the visibility tremendously of the RM program and led to the generation of departmental schedules where every record series in every office was scheduled basically, and individual departmental schedules were produced. This was an extremely time-intensive and resource-intensive means of getting retention schedules out, but it was seen as a worthy investment of time and resources to ensure that folks were familiar with the principles and the processes and the intended outcomes of an RM program. In the early 2000s, after the records management program had been a part of Simmons for probably about 8 to 10 years, maintaining all these multiple schedules had led to inconsistencies. In essence, as you've probably learned in class, folks have very different appraisals of the value of their records, and it's very important for a records manager to not only take them at their word, but also do a little bit of pushback and investigation. There was a fair amount of, if someone said that something had to be kept for 10 years, it was kept for 10 years. If someone else who had a similar record series in their office wanted it kept for 5 years, it was kept for 5 years. These kind of inconsistencies are extremely detrimental to maintaining a program's authority. So one of my first jobs here as a records manager was to sort of do away or dial back, I guess, sort of the maintaining of all these multiple individual office departmental schedules. These very departmental specific retention periods were actually leading to inconsistencies in the retention of the records and in turn undermining the value of the program. Also, to be totally honest, it was very difficult to update and maintain and make universal changes in the face of any regulatory changes that might have come down. So that was, as I mentioned, that was one of my first projects, was to develop functional record schedules, which I'm sure you've discussed in class already, where I created a schedule for all admissions records, regardless of whether it was undergraduate, graduate, or sort of a satellite admissions program. Likewise, academic departments produce pretty much the same kind of record, whether you're a psychology department or a sociology department, so I simply standardized a lot of that record keeping as well. It's also worthy of note that in a lot of these departments, particularly academic departments, there's not a tremendous amount of regulatory issues at play. For as important as they think they are, faculty members' records aren't under any particular governance or regulation. So it's largely to retain as needed and then transfer to the university archives. Other departments such as finance or the treasurer's office, student accounts, student admissions, HR, those are much more critical to be sure that there are consistent, clear policies. After I'd been doing this kind of work and doing a fair amount of direct outreach to departments, working with them one-on-one to build and construct sort of schedules that reflected the entire functionality of their records, I actually received an institutional mandate from the Board of Trustees. I was reached out to from Simmons University's lawyer, the college counsel at the time, who asked that I develop a records management policy for the entire college. This had been discussed since the mid-90s, but had never been been followed up on. So that opportunity was a really important one because at that point I had not only the visibility and the goodwill I'd attained by going door to door and working with departments one by one, I also had an institutional mandate which gave me some form of backing So if some office proved to be non-compliant, say, with records retention, I could tout, that this is supported and mandated by the governing body of the college. So that was very important. With that kind of in my back pocket, I developed functional retention schedules, which sort of even took what I'd previously done with individual departments and sort of functions and did that across the entire institution. So rather than having records of the Office of Sponsored Programs, I developed a record series for research records, which included the records of the Office of Sponsored Programs, as well as those held by, for instance, individual departments, or the Provost's office, or the Financial Bursar's Comptroller's office. So with some of those functional schedules, and I believe I produced about 8 or 10 of them at the time, personnel records, student records, finances and real estate records, those types of things, were very well received, and you can actually see them on, and I published them all online as sort of PDFs, and we're been very fortunate to get the support from the University Council's office, and the record retention policy is sort of introduced to all incoming staff members now during their HR orientation, as well as prominently featured in the internal policies page here at the college. So that kind of institutional support is truly invaluable, particularly a place where regulatory compliance is not, as I've mentioned, of as considerable or high a concern. Certainly, moving forward, we've done a fair amount of shifting, I guess, the record-keeping practices here at the college. What used to be done largely in paper format has now migrated almost wholly to electronic record-keeping. And we now work with record-keeping infrastructures have been totally remade, and we've contracted with outside vendor to handle much of our student records as well as financial records. So a lot of my job in the past few years with regards to records management has been partnering, collaborating with IT, information technology here, to ensure that some of the overriding concerns that should be part of any records management system are built into these record-keeping systems that we have now. So that's a very important step that we're having to take here at this Simmons University Archives. Another aspect, and despite all that, we still do handle about 200 cubic feet of records annually come through our door for short-term retention. And that number has decreased dramatically over my time here. It used to be much closer to 600 feet of records. So it's dropped by at least 2/3, and I'm sure will continue to decimate over time. That said, records management is very important to continue to work with IT in this collaborative consultancy almost role. And just because folks think they're doing the right thing with their records doesn't always mean they are, and no amount of retention schedule can sort of compensate, if you will, for negligent record keeping. So now a lot of my attention has to turn to any office which may have a large backlog of unmanaged, and in turn, basically risky records that they're keeping. So the bad thing now is that I work directly with technology on some levels, but most of my ground-to-ground, my customer-to-customer, I guess, business-to-customer outreach is to those offices that are not being compliant with records management practices. So another important aspect of moving forward is working to maintain awareness of the changing platforms and systems that are at play here at the university to make sure that permanent records can be effectively transferred to the university archives, and that non-permanent records can be destroyed at their appropriate point in the retention cycle. I want to close just with some challenges and opportunities that records management, that I as a records manager in this particular environment face. Certainly one of the biggest challenge are sort of arranged around the principles of electronic record keeping. There tends to be a bit of, despite the fact that I'm able to oftentimes have a seat at the table for records systems issues. It's not a given that I'll be there, and largely it depends upon me or my colleagues in library administration being made aware of a change that's coming and identifying the right opportunities for me to insert myself into some of these conversations. So being at the table for decision making is a very critical and important thing. And then at the end of the day, there's always a degree of lack of clarity and even some tension sometimes between IT and records management and who has responsibility for what. Another more existential issue, I guess, is the departmental record keeping and record creating practices continue to change as we've moved farther and farther from a paperless office into a born digital, stored digital, and even moved into cloud storage options. There's this sense that storage is a non-issue. If something's out of sight, it's out of mind. So from an archivist standpoint, archivist who has records management responsibility standpoint, I'm very cognizant of the fact that there may well be permanent records which are being stored on individuals' personal drives and as such become inaccessible to me in a way that never would have happened were there materials, printed papers in a file cabinet. But that's a story I'm sure you'll hear practically any archivist bemoan. Of course, this always challenges of perception as well when you're an archivist who has records management duties. First of all, folks always say that archives are just for old things. And this is something I come up against whether I'm doing outreach for collection development or working with administrative offices to ensure they transfer over accreditation reports or whatnot to me. Like they always think of the archives as the place to go for the yearbooks from 1920, which is vastly true, you know, because we are that place. But they also are, archives also are the place where you want to put the yearbooks from 2020 to ensure that they'll be available 100 years from now, just as the 1920s are. And that involves a fair amount of outreach, and that's just a constant amongst archivists, particularly at smallish institutions. And then there's the issues, the problems presented by user overconfidence, I guess, where they'll say, my records are perfectly well organized, I can find anything I need. And that's because they've developed a nomenclature that is highly personalized to them, which doesn't always promote discovery amongst colleagues, and certainly might not promote sort of effective transfer and discoverability when moved into an institutional archives. So that's another point where the records management and archives worlds create some tensions and disparities of perception. I mean, all that being said, there are significant opportunities presented by having this dual appointment, if you will, of archivist and records manager. And first and foremost, as it has been since the 90s when this position was developed, is that it provides the opportunity to engage in collection development, to actively work with offices on you're able to be a better gadfly, I guess, when you're able to throw records retention around as a means of acquiring permanent records for an institutional archives. And finally, it gives me a degree of an authoritative stance from which to work with offices. It brings me into levels of discussion around institutional governance and transparency, partnering with folks in administration, with the University Council's office. It's an important stance, and I'm very appreciative of opportunities, whether with legal or IT, to be at the table, to be ensured that these conversations are ongoing and that the archives and records management functions of the university archives have a place in those discussions moving forward. So that's, I think, a fairly concise, I hope, and useful overview for you. There are some additional readings this week that will be shared in the Moodle, as well as some discussion questions. And thank you so much for your time, and have fun reading and thinking about institutional archives and records management. Thanks. Cut.